They say it's just a story. So why do people hear footsteps after listening? Silence doesn't protect you. It listens. And tonight, something might be listening back. Before you drift off and forget, hit like and subscribe. And tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it? That helps me bring the next story even closer to you. The rain always brings it back to me. That persistent drumming against the windows. The way water traces crooked paths down glass, like fingers searching for a way in. That's when the memories surface, unbidden and unwelcome. Do you believe in echoes? Not the acoustic phenomenon where sound bounces back to you from distant surfaces. I mean the other kind, where moments in time repeat themselves, playing out again and again like a skipping record, where past and present bleed into one another until you can no longer tell which is which. I didn't believe in them either, until 3 months ago. I work as a night auditor at the Blackmore Hotel, an aging Victorian edifice perched on the cliffs overlooking the North Sea. It's the sort of place tourists visit in summer for its faded grandeur and spectacular views. But come winter, we're lucky to have 3 rooms occupied on any given night. The hotel has stood for over a century, weathering countless storms that batter the coastline. The locals have their stories, of course. Tales of smugglers using the sea caves below, of shipwrecks visible from the cliffs during particularly low tides, of guests who checked in but never checked out. The usual folklore that surrounds any old building in the British countryside. I've worked there for 6 years and had never experienced anything I couldn't explain away with logic. Creaking floorboards, settling foundations, flickering lights, outdated wiring, strange noises in the night, just the wind finding its way through the building's many cracks and crevices. Until that night in January, the night of the worst storm I'd seen in my tenure. It had been raining for 3 days straight, the kind of relentless downpour that makes you wonder if it might never stop. The sea was violent, waves crashing against the cliffs with such force that the spray reached the hotel windows. 4 stories up. Most of the staff had been sent home early, unable to make the journey back to town once their shifts ended. The few guests, a middle-aged couple from Edinburgh and a business traveler from London, had retreated to their rooms after dinner. By midnight, I was alone in the lobby, reconciling the day's accounts and preparing the morning reports. The power had been flickering all evening, so I'd lit several candles as a precaution. Their flames cast long, dancing shadows across the wood panel walls and marble floor. I remember checking my watch, 12:17 a.m., and the front doors flew open with a bang that made my heart leap into my throat. Wind and rain gusted into the lobby, extinguishing half the candles and sending papers scattering from my desk. And there, silhouetted against the storm, stood a figure, a woman. I realized as she stepped into the dim light, soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her pale face, her gray dress clinging to her slight frame. She couldn't have been more than 30, with delicate features that might have been beautiful if not contorted by what appeared to be extreme distress. "I need a room," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her bedraggled appearance. "Just for tonight." I stood, startled by her sudden appearance. "Of course, madam. Are you all right? Did your car break down?" She didn't answer my question. "A room," she repeated. "Preferably one that doesn't face the sea." Something about her manner unsettled me, but I attributed it to the lateness of the hour and the dramatic entrance. I retrieved a key from a rack behind me. Room 217, on the side of the hotel that faced the moors rather than the cliffs. "Will you be needing any luggage brought in?" I asked, noting that she had arrived empty-handed. "No," she said. "I have nothing with me." As I processed her check-in, I noticed that her clothes were not just wet, but oddly old-fashioned. The kind of dress one might see in photographs from the 1940s. Perhaps she'd been at a costume party. I reasoned, though who would host such an event in the middle of nowhere during a storm? Your name, please? I asked, pen poised over the registry. Eleanor Webb, she replied, then added with the faintest of smiles. But you already knew that, didn't you? A chill ran down my spine. I had never seen this woman before in my life. I'm sorry, have we met? I asked. She stared at me for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to look through me rather than at me. No, she finally said. Not yet. Before I could respond to this cryptic statement, there was a tremendous crash of thunder, and the remaining lights went out, plunging the lobby into near total darkness save for a few candles that had survived the draft. In the seconds it took my eyes to adjust, the woman, Eleanor, had moved. She now stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, one hand on the banister, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Room 217, I called after her, holding out the keys she had failed to take. Would you like me to show you the way? I know the way, she replied, and began ascending the stairs. I should have found this odd. How could she know the layout of a hotel she'd never visited? But instead, I felt a strange resignation, as if this scene had played out before. I returned to my desk, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. The storm continued to rage outside, rain lashing against the windows with renewed fury. I lit more candles and tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange guest. After about 20 minutes, I decided to check on her. It was unusual for a guest to arrive so late without luggage, in such a state, and during such weather. Perhaps she needed assistance, dry clothes, food, a telephone call to someone worried about her whereabouts. I took a candle and made my way up the stairs to the second floor. The corridor was pitch black, the emergency lights having failed along with the main power. My candle cast an insufficient glow that barely illuminated a few feet ahead. Room 217 was at the end of the hall. As I approached, I noticed something odd. Water seeping out from under the door, forming a growing puddle on the carpet. Ms. Webb, I called, knocking firmly. Is everything all right? No response. I knocked again, louder this time. Ms. Webb, I need to check that you're okay. Still nothing. The water continued to spread across the carpet, concerned that a pipe might have burst, though that wouldn't explain why it was only affecting this room. I used my master key to unlock the door. The scene that greeted me as I pushed it open is one I'll never forget. The room was empty, not just devoid of a person, but completely empty. No bed, no furniture, no curtains on the windows, just bare floorboards and peeling wallpaper. And water. Water everywhere, pooling on the floor inches deep, still flowing from an unknown source. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was that room 217 had been sealed off for renovations for the past 3 months. It shouldn't have been on the key rack at all. And the key I held in my trembling hand was not the modern electronic card we'd upgraded to years ago, but an old brass key that hadn't been used in decades. I backed out of the room, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Had I given her the wrong key? Had she gone to a different room? But if so, where was the water coming from? As I turned to head back to the lobby, a movement at the end of the corridor caught my eye. A figure, a woman in a gray dress, was walking slowly toward the service stairs that led to Cliff's. Her wet footprints marked her path on the carpet. Ms. Webb. I called out, hurrying after her. She didn't turn or acknowledge me in any way. When I reached the service door, it was ajar, cold air and the sound of the storm rushing in. I followed, emerging onto a narrow, covered walkway that connected the main building to what had once been the servants' quarters but was now used for storage. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet, and my candle was instantly extinguished. In the brief flashes of lightning, I could see her figure moving steadily toward the cliff edge, where a small gazebo stood. A Victorian addition meant to provide guests with a sheltered spot to admire the sea views. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice lost in the howling wind. "It's not safe." I ran after her, rain stinging my face, my shoes slipping on the wet stone path. When I reached the gazebo, she was standing at its edge, looking out at the churning sea below. "Ms. Webb," I gasped, out of breath from the run and the fear. "Please come back inside. It's dangerous out here." She turned then, and in a flash of lightning, I saw her face clearly for the first time. Her eyes were not dark as I thought, but pale. So pale they appeared almost white, and her skin had a translucent quality, as if I could see through it to the bone beneath. "Every year," she said, her voice somehow perfectly audible despite the storm. "Every year on this night, I return. And every year, someone follows me out here." "What do you mean?" I asked, a creeping dread spreading through me. "January 22nd, 1947, she said. "That's when I jumped. The papers called it a tragedy. Young wife of hotel owner commits suicide during record storm. They never found my body. The sea kept me." I stood frozen, unable to process what she was saying. That's not possible. "Check your registry," she said. "January 22nd, every year. I always get the same name. I always ask for room 217, my room. And someone always follows me out here." Another flash of lightning. Closer this time, the thunder immediate and deafening. When my vision cleared, she was standing on the very edge of the cliff, outside the gazebo's protection. "Why?" I managed to ask. "Why do you come back?" She smiled then, a terrible, knowing smile. "Because I'm not alone down there. And misery loves company." With those words, she stepped backward into empty air. I lunged forward, a scream tearing from my throat as I reached for her. But my hands grasped nothing but rain and wind. I nearly followed her over, stopping myself just in time, my toes at the very edge of precipice. Far below, the black waves crashed against jagged rocks. She was gone. I stumbled back to the hotel, numb with shock and cold. In the lobby, I found the power had returned. The first thing I did was check the registry, my hand shaking as I turned the pages back. And there it was, every year on January 22nd, going back decades. Eleanor Webb, room 217, no luggage, and beside each entry, in different handwriting each time, staff member missing, presumed drowned. I slammed the book shut and backed away from it. My predecessor had never mentioned this. No one had. Was it possible they didn't remember? Or did the knowledge die with each victim? The clock on the wall read 12:17 a.m., the same time she had arrived. But that had been at least an hour ago. As this realization dawned on me, the front doors flew open once more. Wind and rain gusted into the lobby, extinguishing the lights. And there, silhouetted against the storm, stood a figure. I ran, out the back door, through the kitchen, away from the hotel, away from the cliffs. I didn't stop until I reached a village 3 miles inland, where I collapsed at the door of the local pub, babbling about ghosts and drownings and time folding on itself. They put it down to shock, possibly hypothermia. No one believed my story. When day broke and we returned to the hotel, everything was normal. Room 217 was still sealed for renovation. The registry showed no entry for Eleanor Webb. The night manager from a previous shift, not me, had sent an email at 1 a.m. reporting that all was quiet. I quit that day, moved to London, tried to forget. But here's the thing about echoes. They follow you. 3 nights ago, I woke to the sound of water dripping in my flat. When I went to investigate, I found wet footprints leading from my front door to my bedroom. They stopped at the foot of my bed. Tonight is January 22nd. It's storming in London, unusual for this time of year. The weatherman said. The rain is drumming against my windows, tracing crooked paths down the glass like fingers searching for a way in. And I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Do you hear that? Under the sound of the rain? That rhythmic dripping getting closer. I think she found me. Where are you listening to this from? Is it raining there too? Are you alone? Really alone? Look over your shoulder just to be sure. Because echoes don't just repeat. They spread. The room was empty. Not just devoid of a person, but completely empty. No bed, no furniture, no curtains on the windows. Just bare floorboards and peeling wallpaper. And water. Water everywhere. Pooling on the floor inches deep. Still flowing from an unknown source. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was that room 217 had been sealed off for renovations for the past 3 months. It shouldn't have been on the key rack at all. And the key I held in my trembling hand was not the modern electronic card we'd upgraded to years ago, but an old brass key that hadn't been used in decades. I backed out of the room, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Had I given her the wrong key? Had she gone to a different room? But if so, where was the water coming from? As I turned to head back to the lobby, a movement at the end of the corridor caught my eye. A figure, a woman in a gray dress, was walking slowly toward the service stairs that led to Cliff's. Her wet footprints marked her path on the carpet. Ms. Webb. I called out, hurrying after her. She didn't turn or acknowledge me in any way. When I reached the service door, it was ajar. Cold air and the sound of the storm rushing in. I followed, emerging onto a narrow, covered walkway that connected the main building to what had once been the servants' quarters, but was now used for storage. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet, and my candle was instantly extinguished. In the brief flashes of lightning, I could see her figure moving steadily toward the cliff edge, where a small gazebo stood. A Victorian addition meant to provide guests with sheltered spot to admire the sea views. Stop! I shouted, my voice lost in the howling wind. It's not safe. I ran after her, rain stinging my face, my shoes slipping on the wet stone path. When I reached the gazebo, she was standing at its edge, looking out at the churning sea below. Ms. Webb. I gasped, out of breath from the run and the fear. Please come back inside. It's dangerous out here. She turned then, and in a flash of lightning, I saw her face clearly for the first time. Her eyes were not dark as I thought, but pale. So pale they appeared almost white, and her skin had a translucent quality, as if I could see through it to the bone beneath. Every year, she said, her voice somehow perfectly audible despite the storm. Every year on this night, I return. And every year, someone follows me out here. What do you mean? I asked, a creeping dread spreading through me. January 22nd, 1947, she said. That's when I jumped. The papers called it tragedy. Young wife of hotel owner commits suicide during record storm. They never found my body. The sea kept me. I stood frozen, unable to process what she was saying. That's not possible. Check your registry, she said. January 22nd every year. I always give the same name. I always ask for room 217, my room. And someone always follows me out here. Another flash of lightning. Closer this time. The thunder immediate and deafening. When my vision cleared, she was standing on the very edge of the cliff, outside the gazebo's protection. Why? I managed to ask, why do you come back? She smiled, then a terrible, knowing smile, because I'm not alone down there, and misery loves company. With those words, she stepped backward into empty air. I lunged forward, a scream tearing from my throat as I reached for her, but my hands grasped nothing but rain and wind. I nearly followed her over, stopping myself just in time, my toes at the very edge of precipice. Far below, the black waves crashed against jagged rocks. She was gone. I stumbled back to the hotel, numb with shock and cold. In the lobby, I found the power had returned. The first thing I did was check the registry, my hands shaking as I turned the pages back. And there it was. Every year on January 22nd, going back decades, Eleanor Webb, room 217. No luggage, and beside each entry, in different handwriting each time, staff member missing, presumed drowned. I slammed the book shut and backed away from it. My predecessor had never mentioned this. No one had. Was it possible they didn't remember? Or did the knowledge die with each victim? The clock on the wall read 12:17 a.m., the same time she had arrived. But that had been at least an hour ago. As this realization dawned on me, the front doors flew open once more. Wind and rain gusted into the lobby, extinguishing the lights. And there, silhouetted against the storm, stood a figure. I ran, out the back door, through the kitchen, away from the hotel, away from the cliffs. I didn't stop until I reached the village 3 miles inland, where I collapsed at the door of the local pub, babbling about ghosts and drownings and time folding on itself. They put it down to shock, possibly hypothermia. No one believed my story. When day broke and we returned to the hotel, everything was normal. Room 217 was still sealed for renovation. The registry showed no entry for Eleanor Webb. The night manager from the previous shift, not me, had sent an email at 1 a.m. reporting that all was quiet. I quit that day, moved to London, tried to forget. But here's the thing about echoes. They follow you. 3 nights ago, I woke to the sound of water dripping in my flat. When I went to investigate, I found wet footprints leading from my front door to my bedroom. They stopped at the foot of my bed. Tonight is January 22nd. It's storming in London. Unusual for this time of year. The weatherman said. The rain is drumming against my windows, tracing crooked paths down the glass like fingers searching for a way in. And I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Do you hear that? Under the sound of the rain? That rhythmic dripping, getting closer. I think she found me. Where are you listening to this from? Is it raining there too? Are you alone? Really alone? Look over your shoulder, just to be sure, because echoes don't just repeat. They spread. As my eyes adjusted, I found myself in what was indeed a pub, or something like it. A long wooden bar stretched along one wall. Tables and chairs dotted the flagstone floor. A fire smoldered in a large hearth, providing the room's only light. But what struck me immediately was that the place felt wrong in the same way the buildings outside did. Everything was too clean, too perfect, as if it had been constructed for a film set rather than actual use. No scratches on the bar top, no rings left by wet glasses, no accumulated grime in the corners that even the most diligent cleaner would miss. And it was empty. No barman, no patrons, despite the fire and a single oil lamp burning on the bar. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "Anyone here? My lorry's broken down outside." No response. I moved further into the room, the floorboards creaking beneath my wet boots. "I just need to use a phone. If you've got one," I continued, more filled with silence than with any expectation of an answer. As I approached the bar, I noticed a ledger lying open beside the oil lamp. Curious, I glanced down at it. It appeared to be a guest registry, with a list of names written in an elegant, old-fashioned script. The last entry caught my eye because the ink still looked wet. Daniel Mercer. Arrived 1:17 a.m. My name. The exact time my watch had shown when I first turned off the motorway. A cold that had nothing to do with my rain-soaked clothes seeped into my bones. I hadn't given my name to anyone. I hadn't spoken to a single person since Manchester. The fire in the grate suddenly flared, casting the room in a brighter light. In that moment, I noticed what I had somehow missed before. The room was full of people. They sat at every table, stood against the walls, lined the bar, men and women of various ages, all dressed in clothes from different eras spanning what looked like centuries. Some wore simple medieval-looking garments, others Victorian attire, while a few were in more modern clothes from the mid-20th century. And they were all staring at me, completely motionless, silent. Their stillness was what had made them invisible to me at first. That in the fact that they seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, as if they were made of something that devoured illumination. As my eyes darted from figure to figure in growing panic, I noticed something else. They were all soaking wet, not as if they'd been caught in the rain, but as if they'd been submerged in water. Their clothes and hair clung to them, and small puddles had formed at their feet. The figure nearest to me, a middle-aged man in what looked like 1940s clothing, opened his mouth as if to speak. Instead of words, water poured out, splashing onto the floor. The others began to do the same, their mouths opening in unison, releasing torrents that quickly began to flood the room. I backed toward the door, my heart pounding against my ribs with such force it was painful. The water was already ankle deep and rising rapidly. "What do you want?" I gasped, fumbling behind me for the door handle. The nearest figure, the man from the 40s, took a step toward me. Then another. His movement was wrong, somehow stuttering, as if I were watching him through a strobe light. When he spoke, his voice gurgled through the water still seeping from his mouth. "Drivers," he said. "We need drivers." I found the door handle at last and yanked it open, tumbling out into the rainy night. To my horror, the water flowed out with me, and as I looked back, I saw the figures moving toward the door in that same stuttering motion. I ran to my lorry, clambering into the cab and frantically turning the key. By some miracle, the engine started immediately, roaring to life as if it had never faltered. I threw it into gear and accelerated away, not caring about the narrowness of the road or the poor visibility. My only thought was to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. In my mirrors, I could see them, dozens of figures spilling out from the pub and the other buildings, moving down the road after me in that jerky, time-lapse manner. And behind them, more figures emerged from the darkness of surrounding countryside, all converging on the road. I drove recklessly, far too fast for the conditions, but fueled by a terror more immediate than any concern for road safety. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, I spotted a junction ahead with a modern road sign, the first I'd seen since leaving the motorway. It pointed toward the A74, the main route to Edinburgh. As I turned onto this wider road, I checked my mirrors again. The figures were gone, so it was a narrow lane I just left, replaced by an ordinary-looking farm track that bore no resemblance to the road I'd been driving on. 20 minutes later, I was back on the M74, surrounded by the comforting normality of occasional passing cars and the distant glow of a service station ahead. I pulled in, parked, and sat shaking my cab for nearly an hour, trying to convince myself that exhaustion and the poor weather caused me to hallucinate or dream the entire experience. But when I finally summoned the courage to step down from the cab, I found the floor mat soaked with water that couldn't be explained by the rain alone. Water that tasted of salt when I touched the drop to my tongue. I completed my delivery to Edinburgh, though I have no clear memory of the rest of the journey. When I returned south, I made inquiries about roadworks on the M6 north of Kendal. There have been none scheduled or carried out during that period. I've tried researching the area where I believe the village was located, but maps show nothing but empty moorland. Local history archives mention no settlements in that vicinity, abandoned or otherwise. 3 days after the incident, my sat-NAV switched itself on while I was asleep in my cab at a service station near Birmingham. When I woke, it was displaying a location I didn't recognize, somewhere in the Highlands. The screen showed a route through increasingly minor roads, terminating at an unnamed body of water. I disconnected the device immediately and bought a replacement. Since then, I've noticed certain changes. My clothes never seem to fully dry, no matter how long I leave them hanging. There's a persistent smell of damp in my cab that no amount of air freshener can disguise. And sometimes when I'm driving at night, I catch glimpses of wet footprints appearing on my windscreen from the inside. But the most disturbing development began last week, when I noticed my satellite navigation system had started rerouting me, even when I hadn't programmed a destination. Each suggested route would lead toward the same area of Scotland, regardless of where I was heading. I've disabled all my electronic navigational devices now. I stick to paper maps and familiar roads. Yesterday, I found an entry in my logbook that I know I didn't write. A single line in handwriting not quite my own. We need more drivers. I've handed in my notice at work. This will be my last week on the road. I don't know if that will be enough. If whatever has attached itself to me is connected to my profession or to me personally. But I have to try something. So if you're listening to this while driving, especially at night, especially in the rain, I urge you, stick to the main roads. Ignore diversions that aren't mentioned on traffic reports. And if your sat-NAV tries to direct you onto an unfamiliar route, turn it off. Turn it off and keep driving. Don't slow down. Don't stop, because I don't think they're confined to that one village anymore. I think they're spreading, setting up their lures on dark, wet roads throughout the country, waiting for tired drivers to make a simple, fatal mistake. Can you hear that? The particular rhythm of this rainfall? Sometimes I think there's a pattern to it, like a code or a message. Listen carefully. It almost sounds like words, doesn't it? We need drivers. We need you. I've worked the night shift at Thornfield Memorial Hospital for 11 years. 11 years of pushing gurneys down dim corridors, of transporting patients to and from operating theaters, of moving the deceased to a morgue in the basement, It's a job most people wouldn't choose. Walking those quiet halls when the rest of the world sleeps. Hearing the buildings settle and creak like a living thing. Catching glimpses of movement at the edge of your vision that vanish when you turn your head. Are you listening to this alone? Perhaps in your bed, with the rain tapping gently against your window? Keep the lights on. Trust me on this. Most nights at the hospital follow a predictable pattern. The emergency department bustles until around 2 a.m., when even the most determined revelers have called it a night. Then a strange calm descends, with only the occasional new arrival breaking the quiet. Those of us who work these hours develop routines to pass the time. Crosswords, books, quiet conversations in the staff room. But every hospital has its stories. Thornfield more than most. It's a Victorian building at its core, though extensions and renovations have created a labyrinthine complex that spans several acres. The oldest section, the East Wing, dates back to 1879. It's been modernized inside, of course, but the bones of the original asylum remain. High ceilings, long corridors, thick walls that muffle sound in unsettling ways. I became a porter after injuring my back working construction. Not my first choice of career, but the hours suited me and the pay was decent enough. The job isn't complicated. Transport patients, deliver specimens to the lab, move equipment, occasionally help nurses shift patients from bed to trolley. But it requires a level of comfort with the more distressing aspects of medicine and with death. I thought I was comfortable with death. I'd seen enough of it in my 40-odd years. I was wrong. It began 6 months ago, on a night much like tonight. The rain had been falling steadily since dusk, drumming against the windows and streaming down the glass in hypnotic patterns. I remember checking my watch, 3:14 a.m., when my pager buzzed. A deceased patient needed transport from Ward 7 to the morgue. A routine task, one I performed hundreds of times. I collected the mortuary trolley, essentially a gurney with concealing cover, and made my way to Ward 7, a general medical ward in the East Wing. The night nurse, Helen, was waiting for me outside the side room where they placed the deceased. Male, 82, natural causes, she said, her voice hushed out of respect rather than necessity. The nearest living patient was 3 rooms away. Family's been informed but won't be in until morning. I nodded, following her into the room. The deceased lay on the bed, already prepared, a sheet pulled up to his chin. His face was peaceful, almost waxy in the dim light. The room had that particular stillness that settles around the recently departed, as if the air itself is holding its breath. With Helen's help, I transferred the body onto the trolley and covered it with a concealing sheet. "I'll see to the paperwork," she said, returning to the nurse's station. "I've transported enough bodies to know they sometimes make sounds. Air escaping the lungs can create sighs. Settling organs can produce gurgles. The body continues to change after death. This knowledge didn't prepare me for what happened as I wheeled the trolley toward the service lift. "It's quite cold tonight, isn't it?" The voice was so clear, so conversational, that I actually looked around the empty corridor before realizing it had come from beneath the sheet. I froze, my hands gripping the trolley handle so tightly my knuckles whitened. I'm not a fanciful man. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits or any such nonsense. So I told myself I'd imagine it, a trick of acoustics in the old building, perhaps a staff member in a nearby room. I continued toward the lift, the wheels of the trolley squeaking slightly on the polished floor. They won't notice I'm gone until morning. Would you believe that? I stopped again, my heart thundering against my ribs. There was no mistaking it this time. The voice had definitely come from the trolley. With trembling hands, I lifted the sheet. The old man lay exactly as before, eyes closed, skin pallid, completely and undeniably dead. I replaced the sheet, my mind racing. Was I overtired? Having some sort of breakdown? Or was this a macabre prank played by bored night staff? I reached the lift and pressed the call button, eager now to complete this task and return to the brightly lit porter's lodge where my colleagues would be drinking tea and complaining about management. As I waited, I became aware of a subtle change in the way of the trolley, a shift as if the body had moved, not the dramatic sit-up straight of horror films, but a gentle repositioning, like someone turning in their sleep. The lift arrived with a cheerful ding that seemed obscenely inappropriate. I wheeled the trolley inside and pressed the button for the basement. As the doors closed and the lift began its descent, the voice came again. Do you know, I don't think I'm actually dead. It was said conversationally, as if remarking on the weather. I pressed myself against the lift wall, as far from the trolley as the small space would allow. I mean, I know what they told you, the voice continued. Natural causes and all that. But between you and me, I think there's been a mistake. I closed my eyes, taking deep breaths, telling myself this wasn't happening. The lift seemed to be descending impossibly slowly. Would you mind checking? Just to be sure? It would be terrible to wake up in one of those refrigerated drawers. The lift shuddered to a halt at the basement level. I practically lunged to the open doors, yanking the trolley with me. The basement corridor stretched ahead, harshly lit by fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently, creating strobing shadows. The morgue was at the far end. Have you ever experienced true terror? Not fear, not apprehension, but that primal, paralyzing dread that turns your blood to ice? The certainty that you're in the presence of something that shouldn't exist? I stood in that corridor, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. The rational part of my brain insisted I was experiencing some sort of hallucination or psychological episode. The primitive part knew better. Hello? The voice had changed, become uncertain. Are you still there? I can't see anything under this sheet. I forced myself to move, pulling the trolley down the corridor. Just get to the morgue. Hand over the body. Let it be someone else's problem. The morgue doors loomed ahead, the small window in each door providing a glimpse of the clinical space beyond. No staff would be present at this hour. Porters simply leave the deceased in the designated area for the mortuary technicians to process in the morning. You know the problem with dying? The voice said, suddenly sounding much closer, as if the speaker had sat up and was leaning toward me. No one believes you when you say you're not ready. I reached the doors and swiped my ID card with shaking hands. The lock clicked, and I pushed through, dragging the trolley behind me. The morgue was cold, as always. The temperature kept low to slow decomposition. Stainless steel counters gleamed under the harsh lighting. The wall of refrigerated storage units dominated one side of the room. 3 other occupied trolleys were already lined up against the far wall, awaiting morning processing. I parked my trolley alongside them and turned to leave, wanting nothing more than to escape this room, this situation. Wait, the voice called, stopping me in my tracks. You can't just leave me here. I told you, I'm not dead. I didn't turn around. This isn't happening, I whispered to myself. This isn't real. How would you know? The voice asked, suddenly hard and cold. Have you ever died before? Do you know what it feels like when your consciousness lingers but your body won't respond? When you're aware of everything but can't move a muscle? Against my better judgment, I turned back to face the trolley. The sheet lay flat, outlining the still form beneath. Just check, the voice pleaded. Put your hand over my heart. You'll feel it beating. I stood frozen, caught between terror and a bizarre sense of obligation. What if, by some medical miracle, the man actually was alive? Could I live with myself if I abandoned a living person in the morgue? With enormous reluctance, I approached the trolley. My hand hovered over the sheet for a long moment before I slowly drew it back. The old man lay exactly as before, utterly still, eyes closed. But in the harsh morgue lighting, I noticed something I had missed on the ward, a slight bluish tinge to his lips, a particular waxy quality to his skin that comes only with death. This man had been dead for hours. "See," the voice said, though the man's lips didn't move. "Nothing to worry about. I'm fine." I stumbled backward, my hip colliding painfully with a steel counter. "Where are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Who's speaking?" A soft chuckle emanated from everywhere and nowhere. "I'm right here, right where you left me." That's when I noticed the other trolleys, the 3 that had already been in the morgue when I arrived. The sheets covering them were moving, subtly but unmistakably, as if the occupants beneath were breathing. "We're all here," the voice said, now seeming to come from all 4 trolleys at once. All of us caught in between. Not quite gone, you see. Just waiting. Waiting for what? I heard myself ask, though a screaming voice in my head was begging me to run, to flee, to get as far from this place as possible, for someone to notice, someone like you. The sheets began to shift more visibly now, fabric rippling as if hands were pushing up from underneath. Someone who can hear us. I backed toward the door, fumbling blindly behind me for the handle. "Don't go." The voice pleaded, multiplied now, a chorus of whispers. "It's so lonely here, so cold. Stay with us. Listen to our stories." My hand found the door handle, and I yanked it open, practically falling into the corridor beyond. I slammed the door shut behind me and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. I didn't stop until I reached the porter's lodge, where 2 of my colleagues looked up in alarm at my disheveled appearance. I called in sick for the remainder of that shift and the next 3 days. When I finally returned to work, I half convinced myself I'd experienced some sort of exhaustion-induced hallucination until my pager buzzed at 3:14 a.m., summoning me to Ward 7. I've transported 17 deceased patients since that night. Each one has spoken to me. Some plead, some reminisce about their lives. Some simply comment on the journey, as if we're sharing a taxi ride rather than a final trip to morgue. I've learned they can't be heard by others. I tested this theory with a trainee porter who accompanied me on a transfer, while the deceased chatted amiably about the hospital's poor choice of wall color. My colleague noticed nothing amiss. I've also discovered that they only speak between death and processing. Once the mortuary technicians have done their work, the voices fall silent. Perhaps whatever tenuous connection allows this communication is severed by the clinical procedures of the morgue. I haven't told anyone. Who would believe me? I'd be referred to occupational health, probably medicated, definitely removed from my position. And strangely, I've come to see my role differently now. I'm not just transporting bodies. I'm providing company on the final journey, bearing witness to those last, lingering thoughts. But there's one detail that continues to trouble me. Something the old man said that first night, after I'd fled the morgue and locked myself in a bathroom cubicle, trying to steady my breathing. "We'll remember you," he whispered, his voice somehow reaching me despite the distance. "When your time comes, we'll be waiting, and we have so much to show you." I still work at Thornfield, still transport the deceased, still listen to their stories. But lately I've noticed something changing. The living patients have begun to look at me strangely, their eyes tracking me as I move through the wards. Sometimes they fall silent when I enter a room, resuming their conversations only after I've left. Last night, a woman in the oncology ward grabbed my wrist as I passed. "They marked you," she whispered, her eyes wide with a terrible lucidity. "I can see it on you." When I asked what she meant, she just shook her head and released me. "Listen to the rain," she said. "That's them, tapping to be let in. Are you listening to the rain now? That gentle pattern against your window? I wonder, do you hear what I hear? They're saying your name." I've been the keeper at Black Rock Lighthouse for 19 years. 19 winters watching the North Sea rage against the rocky outcrop that hosts the stone tower. 19 summers when the water turns deceptively gentle, hiding the currents that have claimed countless ships over the centuries. Throughout it all, the lighthouse has stood firm, a sentinel of safety, warning vessels away from the treacherous coastline. Are you listening to the rain outside your window? There's something different about rain at sea. It doesn't just fall. It attacks, horizontal sheets driven by winds that can strip paint from wood. The sound isn't the gentle patter you might be hearing now, but a roaring assault that makes conversation impossible, even with yourself. I'm recording this log because I don't think I'll have the chance to write another, and someone should know what happened here. Lighthouses aren't manned anymore, not properly. The old profession of lighthouse keeper has been consigned to history, replaced by automation and occasional maintenance visits. Black Rock was one of the last to be converted. Its remote location and particular challenges making the transition more complex than most. I stayed on as caretaker and technician, making sure the automated systems function correctly, performing repairs when necessary, and submitting weekly reports to the Maritime Authority. It's a solitary existence, but one that suited me. After my wife died, the thought of returning to a society that moved on without her held little appeal. Here, surrounded by sea and sky, I found a kind of peace in the isolation. The mainland is visible on clear days, a thin smudge of darkness on the horizon, 11 miles distant, close enough to know it's there, far enough to feel removed from it. Communication with shore is maintained via satellite phone and internet, both unreliable during the worst weather. The supply boat comes once a month in summer, less frequently in winter. It's due in 4 days, but I don't expect it to arrive. Not after what's been happening here. It began 3 weeks ago, the night of the first autumn storm. I'd battened down as usual, securing everything that could be moved by wind. The old tower has weathered far worse than a seasonal gale. I was in the living quarters, a circular room about halfway up the structure, reading a dog-eared paperback when the power flickered. Again, nothing unusual during the storm. The backup generators kicked in almost immediately, and I returned to my book. Then the radio crackled to life. It's an old unit, kept more out of tradition than necessity, given the more modern communication equipment. I leave it on out of habit, monitoring the emergency frequency. Usually it's silent save for the occasional chatter between fishing vessels or routine Coast Guard transmissions. That night, through bursts of static, came a voice, requesting immediate assistance. Position 54 degrees, 32 minutes north, 0 degrees, 11 minutes west. Taking on water. I set down my book and adjusted the radio, trying to improve reception. The coordinates placed the vessel dangerously close to Black Rock. This is Black Rock Lighthouse. I responded, "I'm reading you badly. Please repeat your situation and vessel identification." More static than "Mary Carter, severe lift support for souls aboard." I froze. The Mary Carter? That couldn't be possible. The Mary Carter was a fishing trawler that went down near Black Rock in 1994. All hands lost. I knew this because it was the last major incident in these waters before the lighthouse was automated, and because one of those lost had been my brother-in-law, Michael. Please identify yourself again, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. What vessel are you on? The response came through clearer this time, as if the speaker had moved closer to their radio. This is Captain James Halloran of the fishing vessel Mary Carter. We've struck something off Black Rock, taking on water rapidly. Engine room flooded. Need immediate assistance. James Halloran, the captain who'd gone down with the Mary Carter almost 30 years ago. The man whose body was never recovered. A sick joke, surely. Someone from the mainland with too much time and cruelty on their hands. But how would they know to use that name, that vessel? I'm not a man who shares his personal history freely. This frequency is for emergency use only, I said firmly. Misuse is a criminal offense. The voice that came back was different now, less formal, more intimate, as if the speaker had moved right up to the microphone. Edwin, it's Michael. We're in trouble. You need to guide us in. My brother-in-law's voice, perfect in every cadence and inflection, despite him being 27 years dead. I switched off the radio. My hands were shaking so badly I knocked over my mug of tea, barely noticing as it soaked into the carpet. I took several deep breaths, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. A cruel prank, a hallucination brought on by isolation and the howling wind, perhaps a genuine distress call distorted by interference, my mind filling in familiar details. I forced myself to go up to the lantern room, the circular glass chamber at the top of the lighthouse where the light itself is housed. From there, I had a 360-degree view of the surrounding sea. If there truly was a vessel in distress, I would see its running lights. The storm was in full fury now, rain lashing against the glass, the beam from the lighthouse creating strange, shifting patterns in the darkness as it swept across the churning water. I trained my binoculars on the area where a ship at those coordinates would be. Nothing but empty sea and driving rain. I was about to return downstairs when a flash of light caught my eye. Not the consistent glow of running lights, but a brief flare that appeared and vanished within seconds. I adjusted my position, focusing the binoculars on that spot. For several minutes, there was nothing. Then it came again, a momentary glow beneath the surface of the water, as if something illuminated from within was moving in the depths. As I watched, the glow expanded, rose closer to the surface. It wasn't the harsh white of electric lights, but a pale, greenish phosphorescence that seemed to pulsate with rhythm reminiscent of breathing. Have you ever stood at the edge of a vast darkness, sensing something massive moving within it? Something that makes your primitive brain shriek warnings that your rational mind tries to dismiss? I watched that glow approach the lighthouse, moving against the current with deliberate purpose. As it neared, I could make out shapes within the light, vague, elongated forms that might have been human if humans could survive at such depths, could move with such fluid grace through water. The rational part of my mind insisted this was bioluminescence, perhaps a bloom of algae driven to the surface by the storm. The older, more primal part knew better. The light circled the base of the lighthouse, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. I followed it with my binoculars until it disappeared beneath the outcrop on which the tower stands. I waited, expecting it to emerge on the other side, but it never did. The radio in my quarters crackled to life again, the sound carrying up the spiral staircase. Despite the distance and the storm's howl, I could hear my brother-in-law's voice with perfect clarity. "Let us in, Edwin. were so cold. I returned to my quarters and ripped the radio's power cord from the wall. For good measure, I removed the batteries from the backup power supply as well. The resulting silence was momentary relief, until I heard the tapping, gentle at first, barely perceptible beneath the storm's cacophony, a rhythmic pattern against the lighthouse's stone walls, as if something, was knocking to be admitted. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, moving around the circular structure in the same pattern the light had followed in the water. I checked the security system. Cameras showing the dock area and the small helipad for emergency evacuations. Nothing visible, but the sound continued, growing more insistent. I convinced myself it was debris thrown against the lighthouse by the storm. I'm experienced enough to know how the mind can manufacture patterns, find meaning in random noise when isolated. I took a sleeping pill and went to bed. I dreamed of the Mary Carter that night, not as a fishing trawler it had been, but as something altered, transformed by years beneath the waves. In the dream, I stood on the deck as it rose from the depths, water streaming from surfaces crusted with barnacles and stranger growths. The crew moved about their duties, or a semblance of them, their motions jerky and wrong, like malfunctioning clockwork figures. Their faces were remarkably preserved, as if the sea had pickled rather than decayed them. But their eyes were replaced by the same phosphorescent light I'd seen in the water. Michael stood at the bow, looking toward the lighthouse, toward me. His expression was one of profound longing of homecoming. I woke just before dawn to find seawater pooling on my bedroom floor, despite my quarters being 30 meters above sea level. The storm had abated somewhat, though rain still fell steadily. I spent the morning checking the lighthouse for damage, convincing myself that the water had somehow been driven in by the gale. I found no point of ingress, no leaking pipes, no explanation for the salt water that had soaked my carpet. More disturbing was the discovery on the lowest level, where the lighthouse connects to the rock, on the heavy steel door that provides access from the dock. Someone had carved a crude representation of a ship. The metal was gouged deeply, as if by something far stronger and sharper than ordinary tools. The area around the door was damp, with a distinctive smell, not just seawater, but the rich, organic stench of things long submerged. I retreated upstairs and tried to contact the mainland. The satellite phone returned only static. The internet connection was down. Not surprising after such a storm, but frustrating nonetheless. That evening, as darkness fell, I saw the lights again, not just one glow now, but dozens circling the lighthouse like bioluminescent sharks. They moved with clear purpose, occasionally one breaking from the circle to approach the structure, pressing against it as if testing for weakness. The tapping resumed, louder than before. No longer just a gentle knock, but a deliberate percussion that resonated through the stone. It followed patterns, 3 quick taps, a pause, 2 slow ones, over and over, the same sequence. It took me an hour to recognize it as Morse code, LATUSIN. I barricaded myself in the lantern room, reasoning it was the highest point, the furthest from the water. I brought supplies, food, water, my satellite phone in hopes the connection would return. I kept the beam rotating, some irrational part of me believing that its light would keep at bay whatever circled below. Through that long night, I watched the glowing shapes in the water. Now so numerous, they created a continuous ring of light around the lighthouse. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent, until it was a constant hammering that made the old stone vibrate beneath my feet. Toward dawn, it stopped abruptly. The silence was almost worse. I must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion. When I woke, the calm after the storm had arrived. The sea was flat, almost glassy, with heavy mist lying over it like a shroud. No sign of the lights. No movement in the water. I cautiously made my way downstairs, checking each level as I went. Nothing seemed disturbed until I reached the entry level. The steel door, 3 inches thick, designed to withstand the worst the North Sea could throw at it, was warped inward as if struck by a tremendous force. Water had seeped around its edges, leaving a trail across the concrete floor. The trail led to the stairs, my stairs, and glistened with the same faint phosphorescence I'd seen in the water. I ran back up to the radio room and found the emergency flare gun. Not much use as a weapon, but it was all I had. I tried the satellite phone again. This time, instead of static, I heard the gentle wash of waves, as if someone had left the receiver lying on a beach. Beneath that sound, almost subliminal, were voices, a soft, wet chorus singing a shanty I recognized from my childhood on the coast. We'll wait for you at the bottom of the sea, where the water's warm and dark. We'll wait for you at the bottom of the sea. Just follow the glowing mark. My brother-in-law's voice rose above the others for the final verse. We found a truth at the bottom of the sea, a secret best left alone. But we're so lonely at the bottom of the sea, and flesh calls out to bone. I dropped the phone. It clattered on the floor, still emanating that gentle wash of waves, that terrible singing. For 3 days, I've huddled in the lantern room. The weather has cleared completely, a rare stretch of perfect calm for November. The sea around Black Rock is still, reflecting the sky like polished glass. No sign of the lights, no tapping on the walls. But each morning, I find the trail of seawater has advanced up another level of the spiral staircase. Each morning, it's closer to the lantern room. The supply boat is due tomorrow. I've tried every means of communication to warn them away, to tell them not to approach Black Rock. Nothing works. Every electronic device now produces only the sound of waves and distant singing. Last night, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, dragging steps that left wet tracks. They stopped just outside the lantern room door. Something scraped against the wood. Not a knock this time, but a gentle, almost tender caress. Edwin, Michael's voice called, distorted as if speaking through water. Don't you want to know what we found down there? Don't you want to see what's been waiting all this time? I didn't answer. After a while, the footsteps retreated. This morning, the sea is no longer empty. The Mary Carter floats on the calm water about 100 meters from the lighthouse. Not as it was in my dream, broken and barnacled, but pristine as if it had just left port. Its red hull gleams in the morning sun. Figures move about on deck, their movements visible but their features indistinct at this distance. One stands at the rail, looking up at the lighthouse. Even without binoculars, I know it's Michael. I can feel his gaze, patient and expectant. The supply boat will arrive soon. I've written a warning in paint on the helipad, large enough to be seen from the water. Stay away. Infection. They'll see it. They'll call for a quarantine team rather than risking exposure. That should buy me time, though I'm not sure for what. I've no means of escape, nowhere to go. Swimming to the mainland is impossible even in the best conditions. The water has reached the top of the stairs now. It seeps under the door to the lantern room. That same phosphorescent trickle. It smells of salt and decay and something else. Something older and stranger than either. Michael calls to me sometimes. He says they're not dead, not exactly. He says there's room aboard the Mary Carter for one more. He says they've been waiting for me. The hardest part is that I want to go to them. Each day, the urge grows stronger. There's a terrible logic to it. What am I holding on to here? A lonely existence in a technological relic? At least out there, I'd be with family. The water is pooling around my feet as I record this. I backed up as far as I can, pressed against the glass walls of the lantern. Outside, the beam sweeps uselessly over the calm sea, over the Mary Carter waiting patiently for its final crewman. I can see Michael more clearly now. He's waving, a familiar gesture that tugs at memories of happier times. Behind him, the other figures have gathered at the rail. They're waving too, welcoming. The water is rising faster, already ankle deep. It's warmer than it should be, almost pleasant against my skin. The phosphorescence swirls around my legs in patterns that almost form words, images. I understand now. The Mary Carter didn't sink because it struck rocks. It found something out there in the deep, or something found it. Something ancient that has been reaching out to the surface world, using those it captures to capture others. The water is at my knees, and I can feel something moving within it. Soft tendrils wrapping gently around my legs, tugging with surprising strength. Not pulling me down, but pulling me toward the door, toward the stairs that lead to the dock below. I don't think I can resist much longer. If you're listening to this, if you're safe and dry with the rain tapping at your window, be grateful for that barrier of glass and wood and stone. Be grateful for the boundaries that keep the separate worlds apart. And if you find yourself near the coast on a calm night after a storm and see lights moving beneath the water, strange, pulsing lights that seem to watch you from the deep, don't linger. Don't follow them down to the shoreline. Above all, if you hear a tapping at your door during a rainstorm, a rhythm that seems almost like code, almost like language, don't let them in. The door is opening now. I can see Michael on the threshold, standing in water that shouldn't be there, reaching out a hand that glistens wetly in the light. His smile is so familiar, but his eyes are filled with that same phosphorescent glow. He says it's time to go. I think he's right. I never wanted to live in Greystone Heights. It was a compromise born of desperation and limited finances, a decaying Victorian conversion in a forgotten part town where the rent was suspiciously affordable. But when you've just gone through a difficult divorce and your career as an academic is hanging by a thread, you take what you can get. Are you listening to this in your home? Look around for a moment. How well do you know the spaces behind your walls? The people or things that might be separated from you by just a few inches of plaster and timber? I moved into apartment 7C 4 months ago in early January. The timing couldn't have been worse. The depths of winter, when darkness falls by mid-afternoon and the rain seems endless. The kind of weather that makes even the most cheerful surroundings feel oppressive. And Greystone Heights was far from cheerful. The building itself dates back to the 1880s, originally a grand family home for some Victorian industrialists, before being carved into 12 separate flats sometime in the 1960s. It retains vestiges of its former grandeur. High ceilings, ornate cornicing, a magnificent but now neglected central staircase with skylight that casts wan, gray illumination down the 7 floors. My flat, 7C, is on the top floor, tucked into what was once probably servants' quarters. It's small but functional. A combined living room and kitchenette, a cramped bedroom, and a bathroom where the shower temperature fluctuates between scalding and freezing with no discernible pattern. The letting agent had been suspiciously vague about the previous tenants, and why the flat had become available so suddenly. I didn't press the issue, partly because I needed somewhere to live quickly, and partly because I suspected I wouldn't like the answers. The first week passed without incident. I arranged my meager possessions, established a workspace and a small dining table for my research, and began a monotonous routine a rebuilding a life from scratch. The flat was quiet, almost unnaturally so, given its location in a multi-occupancy building. It was on the 8th night that I first heard the tapping. I'd been working late, poring over research papers for a journal publication that might salvage my academic reputation. The rain outside had been constant all day, a steady percussion against the windows that had become white noise. At first, I thought the sound was just another manifestation of the building's elderly plumbing, or perhaps the radiator cooling. 3 gentle taps, then silence. Then 3 more, slightly louder. It seemed to be coming from the wall adjacent to my bedroom, the wall I shared with apartment 7B. I hadn't yet met my neighbors, having only exchanged brief nods with a few residents in the hallway. I assumed 7B contained someone equally reclusive. I ignored the tapping initially, but it continued, growing not louder but more insistent, as if imbued with strange urgency. Eventually, I set aside my work and approached the wall, listening more carefully. The tapping stopped the moment I stood before the wall. I waited, wondering if I should tap back or perhaps introduce myself properly to my neighbor the next day. As I turned to go back to my desk, it resumed, now in a distinct pattern. 3 quick taps, a pause, 2 slow ones, then repeat. It took me a moment to recognize it as Morse code, though I couldn't decipher the message. My knowledge was limited to SOS, and this wasn't it. "Hello," I called, feeling slightly foolish. "I can hear you, but I don't understand Morse code." The tapping ceased immediately. Silence stretched for so long that I began to doubt whether I'd heard anything at all. Then, just as I was about to return to my work, a voice came through the wall, faint but perfectly audible. "Help me?" The voice was female, young-sounding, with an odd, flat quality, as if spoken underwater or through some kind of filter. I pressed closer to the wall. "Are you all right? Do you need me to call someone?" "Help me," the voice repeated, no change in inflection or urgency. "He's coming back soon." A chill ran through me. "Who's coming back? Are you in danger?" Silence again, lasting nearly a minute. Then, "He doesn't know I can reach through. The walls are thin here, thinner than they should be." I didn't know what to make of this. Was my neighbor mentally ill, in an abusive relationship? Or was this some bizarre prank to unsettle the new tenant? "I'm going to call the police," I said firmly. "If you're in trouble, they can help." "No." The force of the exclamation made me step back from the wall. The voice continued, now hushed and rapid. "They came before. They didn't see me. No one sees me anymore, except through the thin places." I retreated to my desk, unnerved but still concerned. I looked up the building's management company online, thinking I should at least report a potential domestic issue. To my surprise, their website listed apartment 7B as currently unoccupied, vacant for the past 3 months following a comprehensive refurbishment. I slept poorly that night, my dreams fragmented by the persistent sound of rain and the memory of that flat, strange voice. I woke several times thinking I heard tapping, but it was just the weather, the endless British winter rain hammering against my window. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I told myself it was out of concern for a potentially vulnerable neighbor, but in truth, curiosity had taken hold. If 7B was supposed to be empty, who had spoken to me through the wall? The hallway outside my flat was dimly lit, the bulb above 7B flickering intermittently. The door to 7B looked identical to mine, dark but with tarnished brass numbers. No sounds came from within. No light showed beneath the door. I knocked firmly. No response. I tried the handle, expecting it to be locked. To my surprise, it turned easily, the door swinging inward with a low creak. The flat beyond was empty, not just unoccupied, but completely bare, No furniture, no curtains, not even light fixtures. Just an empty space with peeling wallpaper and worn floorboards. The air was stale and cold, with a faint musty odor that suggested the windows hadn't been opened in months. I stepped inside hesitantly, calling out a tentative hello. My voice echoed slightly in the empty rooms. The layout mirrored my own flat, though 7B seemed somehow smaller. The proportions slightly wrong in ways I couldn't quite define. The wall we shared was covered in the same faded floor wallpaper as mine, though more extensively damaged. Large patches had peeled away, revealing not the expected plaster beneath, but something darker with an almost reflective quality in the dim light. I approached it cautiously. Up close, I could see that what I had taken for exposed plaster was actually some kind of black substance, not paint or mold, but something with depth, as if the wall opened into a space beyond. It reminded me of water at night, dark and still, but with a suggestion of movement beneath the surface. I reached out, hesitated, then lightly touched the black patch. It was cold, far colder than it should have been, and not solid as I expected, but yielding like thick gel. My fingers sank into it slightly before I yanked it back in shock. As I stared at the wall in disbelief, ripples spread across the black surface, as if my touch had disturbed some liquid barrier. Within those ripples, just for a moment, I thought I glimpsed a face, pale female with dark hollows where the eyes should be. I fled the flat, slamming the door behind me. My heart pounded as I leaned against the corridor wall, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. There had to be a rational explanation. Water damage, perhaps some kind of unusual mold growth that had created an optical illusion. I decided to speak with the building manager. His office was on the ground floor, a converted broom cupboard that barely contained a desk, and a portly, perpetually irritated man who ran the building. Apartment 7B, he repeated when I inquired. Been empty since October. Previous tenant left under difficult circumstances. What kind of difficult circumstances? I pressed. He shifted uncomfortably. Personal matters. Nothing to concern yourself with. Was it a woman? Young? Dark hair. His expression changed, becoming wary. Why do you ask? I think I saw someone in there. Impossible, he said firmly. I have the only keys, and the flat is uninhabitable until renovations are complete. Renovations? Water damage, he explained. Quite extensive. The previous tenant reported issues with the walls. Damp, discoloration. We've had specialists in, but it's proved resistant to treatment. I wanted to ask more, but he made it clear the conversation was over. As I turned to leave, he called after me. Stay out of 7B, Mr. Harrison. The structure isn't sound. That night, the tapping returned. No longer tentative, but insistent, urgent. I tried to ignore it, turning up the volume on my laptop, focusing on my work. But it grew louder, seeming to emanate not just from the bedroom wall now, but from every wall in the flat. Stop it, I shouted finally. Leave me alone. The tapping ceased abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my ears. Then the voice came again, no longer muffled by the wall but clear, as if spoken directly into my ear. I found a way through. I spun around, heart racing. The room was empty. Where are you? I demanded. What do you want? I'm here, the voice said, now seeming to come from the corner of the room. I'm always here, but the walls are thinner now, thin enough to cross. I followed the voice to the corner, where the two exterior walls met. In the dim light, I could see what looked like a damp patch spreading across the wallpaper, a dark stain that hadn't been there earlier. As I watched, it grew, the wallpaper bubbling slightly as if pushed from behind. What's happening? I whispered, backing away. The rain helps, the voice explained. now emanating directly from the spreading stain. It softens the boundaries, makes the walls permeable. The stain continued to expand, darkening as it grew, developing that same depth I'd seen in 7B, not a flat surface, but a window into someplace else. Something moved within it, a pale shape that pressed against the boundary, creating bulges in the wall. I should have run then, should have fled the flat, the building, possibly the city. Instead, a terrible curiosity held me in place. The academic in me still searching for rational explanation, even as the primitive hindbrain screamed danger. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the rain, which had intensified to a deafening drum roll on the roof. The movement within the walls stilled. Then, slowly, a face pushed through, not breaking the surface but distorting it, like a child pressing their face against a dark balloon. I could make out features. Young female, with hair that floated around her head as if suspended in water. I was Emma, the face said, her mouth moving within the viscous surface. I lived in 7B. "What happened to you?" I managed to ask. "I found a way through," she replied, as if this explained everything. There are places in older buildings where the barriers were thin, places where reality has been compromised. I was studying them for my doctoral thesis, recording the phenomena. A chill ran through me. "You were an academic?" "Like you," she confirmed, studying liminal spaces. Theoretical at first, until I moved here and found a real one. The previous occupant had disappeared. You know, everyone assumed she'd simply left. But I found her notes hidden behind the radiator. She'd been documenting it too. The face pushed further into the room, the wall around it stretching obscenely. I could see her shoulders now, covered in what might have been a nightgown, dark with moisture. "The building management knew," she continued. "They've always known. They paint over it, wallpaper over it, plaster over it. But it keeps coming back, especially when it rains. The water finds a way in, and where water goes, other things can follow." I finished, suddenly understanding. She smiled, an expression that stretched too wide, showing teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. "I wanted to document the phenomenon," she said, "to prove it existed. I set up cameras, recording equipment. I was so careful, never touching it, just observing. But then came the storm. 3 days of constant rain. The barrier became so thin, I could hear them whispering from the other side. "Them?" I echoed. "The previous tenants," she explained. "All of them, going back decades. Everyone who found a thin place and went through. They wanted company. They were so persuasive." As she spoke, I noticed other movement within the wall. Other faces pressing forward, less defined than hers, but unmistakably human in outline. Dozens of them, crowding behind her, trying to reach the surface. "I just wanted to touch it once," Emma continued, her voice becoming distorted, wet. "For my research, I didn't believe I could actually pass through, but it pulled me in so quickly, and once you're on the other side." She trailed off, her expression shifting to one of terrible sadness. "It's cold here," she whispered. "So cold and dark, but we found ways to reach back, to make the walls thinner, to find new company." I was backing toward my front door now, fumbling for the handle without taking my eyes off the grotesque protrusion in my wall. Emma's upper body was nearly fully immersed, the black substance dripping from her like tar. Behind her, the other faces pressed closer, their features becoming more distinct. Men and women of various ages, their expressions a uniform mass of desperate hunger. "Don't leave," Emma pleaded. "You don't understand. We need you. Your warmth, your solidity. You could help us find a way back." My hand found the door handle. "I can call someone," I offered weakly. Get help. She laughed, a sound like water flowing down a partially blocked drain. There's no help for us. We've gone too far. But you could join us. See what we've seen. Learn what we've learned. What have you learned? I couldn't help asking, the academic in me making one final stand. Her smile widened further, splitting her face in a way that was anatomically impossible. That reality is just a consensus, that what lies beyond the walls has always been here, watching us through the thin places, that they've been waiting so patiently for us to weaken the barriers enough for them to come through. As she spoke, the black substance began to flow more freely from the wall, pooling on my floor, spreading toward my feet. Within it, I could see movements, not human this time, but sinuous, multi-limbed shapes that made my vision blur when I tried to focus on them. They're coming, Emma said, her voice now a chorus, as if others were speaking through her. They've been so patient. The rain helps them, softens the world, makes everything permeable. I yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway. To my horror, I saw a similar black stain spreading across the corridor walls, bubbling beneath the peeling wallpaper. Faint tapping sounds came from behind every door I passed as I fled down the 7 flights of stairs, the sounds pursuing me like hungry predators. I didn't stop running until I reached the 24-hour cafe 3 blocks away, where I sat trembling over a cup of tea until dawn, watching the rain continue to fall in sheets outside the window. I never returned to apartment 7C. I left everything behind. Clothes, books, research materials, all the physical detritus of my former life. A small price to pay. I found a cheap hotel, then a rental in another city. I told the building management I'd moved out due to unforeseen circumstances and forfeited my deposit. They didn't seem surprised, but I haven't escaped. Not really, because the rain still falls. And in every place I've stayed since, hotels, rentals, even temporarily with colleagues, I've begun to notice small dark stains on the walls, always in the corners first, spreading outward like spilled ink, always growing faster when it rains. Sometimes at night, I hear tapping. 3 quick taps, a pause, 2 slow ones, over and over. Last week, I woke to find a damp patch on the ceiling above my bed, water dripping onto my pillow. Not clear water, but black, viscous liquid that seemed to move of its own accord. Within it, I thought I glimpsed a reflection, not of my room, but of somewhere else entirely, a vast dark space filled with countless pale figures, all staring down at me. Among them was Emma, her face pressed against a barrier, mouth moving silently. But I could hear her voice in my head, as clearly as if she were lying beside me. "The rain helps us find you," she whispered. "It connects all the thin places, creates channels we can follow. And we've been following you, Daniel, following the warmth of your life, the solidity of your reality. I've moved 3 times since then. It doesn't matter. The stains always find me, appearing more quickly with each relocation. The walls in this current flat already show the telltale darkening in the corners. Though I've been here less than a week, I've researched Greystone Heights since my escape. The building has a history. Disappearances dating back to its construction, always explained away. A servant girl in 1887, a gardener in 1912, a family of 3 in 1954. The pattern accelerated after the conversion to flats. More people living there meant more potential to discover the thin places, more chances for whatever waits beyond to reach through. I understand now why my flat was available so suddenly, why the rent was so affordable. Tonight, as the rain beats against my windows, I can hear the tapping from all 4 walls. The stains have spread significantly in just the past hour. They'll reach me before morning, I think. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps there's knowledge to be gained, even for an academic whose career was failing. One final, Definitive research paper on the true nature reality. I can feel droplets on my face now, cold and viscous. The barrier is weakening. Soon it will rupture entirely, and what waits beyond will flow through, drawn to the warmth and solidity of this world like moths to a flame. I should run. I know I should run. But I can't help wondering, what will I see on the other side of the wall? Listen. Can you hear it? The tapping within your own walls? It might be subtle at first. Easy to mistake for the rain or the house settling. But it's there. It's always been there, waiting for you to answer. "23 years I've been driving trains on the London Underground. 23 years of rattling through the darkness beneath one of the world's oldest cities, carrying thousands of passengers who rarely spare a thought for what might exist beyond the illuminated tunnels, in the shadowy recesses of a subterranean network that's been expanding for over 150 years. I know what you're thinking. Another spooky story about the tube, probably involving ghosts of plague victims or mysterious stations that appear only at midnight. I understand the skepticism. I used to feel the same way. The underground attracts urban legends like moths to a flame. Most drivers learn to dismiss them after a few years on the job. But I'm not here to share second-hand tales or recycle myths. I need to tell someone what happened to me 7 weeks ago. What continues to happen every time I drive the Hampstead spur of the Northern Line. Are you somewhere dry right now? Listening to the rain outside, perhaps? How comforting that must be, to have something as ordinary as weather serving as a reminder that the world above still exists, still functions according to natural laws. Hold on to that comfort. You may need it. It was a Tuesday in late January, the kind of bitter, damp evening when London seems to fold in on itself. I was working a late shift, scheduled to make the final northbound journey from Leicester Square to Edgware. The last train of the night is different. Quieter, more solemn somehow. We carry the stragglers, the night workers, those who've lost track of time in pubs or cinemas. There's an unspoken camaraderie among these late travelers, a shared acknowledgement that the city is shutting down around them. That particular night, the train was nearly empty, perhaps a dozen passengers scattered throughout the carriages. Standard for a weeknight in January. We departed Leicester Square on schedule at 0:27. Everything was perfectly normal as we continued north through Tottenham Court Road, Goodge Street, Warren Street. It was after leaving Camden Town, as we entered the deep tunnels approaching Hampstead, that I first noticed something odd. The control panel of my cab showed an unexpected power fluctuation, brief but significant enough to register on the diagnostics. The tunnel lights outside momentarily dimmed, then brightened again. Not entirely unusual. The system is old and glitches occur. Still, I made a mental note to report it at the end of my shift. Hampstead is one of the deepest stations on the network, nearly 60 meters below ground level, with the longest escalators in Western Europe. As we approached, I noticed water seeping down the tunnel walls in greater quantities than normal. Again, not unprecedented. It had been raining heavily for days, and groundwater infiltration is a constant battle in the older sections of the tube. The train slowed automatically as we entered the station. Through the front window of my cab, I could see the platform was deserted save for a single figure standing near the far end, a man in what appeared to be a London transport uniform, though something about it seemed outdated. I assumed he was a maintenance worker, or perhaps station staff finishing a late shift. As the train came to a halt and the doors opened, I glanced at the CCTV monitors showing the length of the train. 3 passengers disembarked, but no one boarded, not even a uniformed man I had seen. When I checked the platform view again, he was gone after the regulation 20-second stop. I closed the doors and prepared to depart. That's when my radio crackled to life. Driver of Northern Line Train 239. This is line control. Be advised we're showing a signal failure at the Hampstead North Tunnel Junction. Hold position until further notice. Over. I acknowledged the instruction and settled in to wait. Signal failures are common enough, particularly in the older sections of the network, usually resolved within minutes. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The remaining passengers shifted restlessly in their seats. I made a standard announcement about the delay, promising updates as soon as I had them. At the 15-minute mark, I tried contacting line control for an update, but received no response, just a low, persistent static. This was unusual. The underground's communication system is generally reliable with multiple redundancies. That's when I noticed the water. It had been seeping steadily through the tunnel walls during our wait, but now it was beginning to pool on the tracks. Not enough to be dangerous, but certainly abnormal. More concerning was its appearance. Rather than the clear or slightly muddy groundwater we typically encounter, this liquid had a murky, almost oily quality, and seemed to glisten strangely under the platform lights. I tried the radio again. Still nothing but static. Though within the white noise, I began to discern what sounded like a voice, distant, hollow, speaking too softly to make out the words. "This is Northern Line 239 at Hampstead." I set firmly into the handset. Water accumulating on the tracks. Request immediate instruction. Over. The static cleared for a moment, and a voice came through, distorted but understandable. Proceed to the end of the platform and wait there. No standard protocol language. No over. No identification from the speaker. Every instinct told me something was wrong with this instruction. Line control, please identify. I requested, following procedure. Your last transmission was unclear. The static returned louder now, but the voice pushed through again. Not line control. Station staff. Can see you from the platform end. Water situation critical. Bring your train forward to the emergency exit point. Quickly. I peered through my cab window toward the far end of the platform. It was poorly lit, the furthest section almost in darkness. I could just make out a figure standing there, similar to the uniformed man I'd seen earlier, but somehow different. His outline seemed less substantial, as if viewed through rippling water. I made a decision then, one that violated protocol, but which I believed was in the interest of passenger safety. I would proceed to Golders Green, the next station, regardless of the signal failure warning. Better to risk disciplinary action than remain in a station with unexplained flooding and compromised communications. I made a brief announcement to the passengers, then released the train's brakes and began to ease forward. The figure at the end of the platform moved suddenly, rushing toward the train with unnatural speed. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of his face as he approached me, or rather, the absence of one. Where features should have been, there was only a dark, fluid emptiness, like a hole punched through reality. I accelerated harder than protocol allowed, the train lurching forward into the tunnel. In my mirrors, I saw the figure halt at the platform edge, its featureless non-face turned toward us as we pulled away. The radio erupted with static, so loud I yanked the headset off. Through the white noise came dozens of voices now, overlapping, echoing, rising and falling in pitch like a grotesque chorus. The tunnel ahead was darker than it should have been, the standard emergency lighting barely functioning. Water streamed down the walls in rivulets that seemed to move against gravity, flowing upward and sideways in defiance of natural law. And then the train's headlights illuminated something in the tunnel ahead. Dozens of figures standing on the tracks. Men and women in London, transport uniforms spanning decades of design from the early 20th century to the present day. All with the same dark void where their faces should have been. All standing perfectly still as my train hurtled toward them. I hit the emergency brakes. The train screamed as it tried to stop. passengers thrown forward by the sudden deceleration. Through the window, I watched in horror as we bore down on the assembled figures. They didn't move, didn't attempt to flee, and when the train should have struck them, they simply rippled like reflections in disturbed water and vanished. The train ground to a halt about halfway between stations. The tunnel was now completely dark save for the dimming emergency lights inside the carriages. The radio had fallen silent. I sat frozen in my cab, heart hammering against my ribs, breath coming in short gasps. What I just witnessed was impossible, hallucinatory, perhaps carbon dioxide poisoning or some sort of gas leak affecting my perception. Behind me, passengers were moving about, voices raised in confusion and alarm. I needed to maintain control of the situation. I switched to the internal communication system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your driver speaking. We're experiencing a technical difficulty and have stopped between stations. Please remain seated. Engineering assistance is on the way. A lie, but a necessary one to prevent panic. I tried the radio again, hoping to reach line control on an emergency channel. Instead of a response, my cab filled with the sound of rushing water, though there was none to be seen. Within that sound, voices whispered, hundreds of them, layered over each other, speaking too quickly to distinguish individual words, yet somehow conveying a collective message that wormed its way into my consciousness. Join us below. We've always been here. Since the first shaft was dug, since the first tunnel broke through. This was our domain before it was yours. My cab door, which I was certain I had locked at the procedure, slowly began to slide open of its own accord. Water began to seep in around the edges, not from outside, but somehow emerging from the metal itself, as if the train were weeping. Driver? A passenger had approached my cab. A middle-aged woman with concerned expression. Is everything all right? Some of us thought we saw people on the track. The sight of another human, normal and solid and real, broke whatever spell had gripped me. I secured the cab door, then turned to address her directly. System failure. I said, striving for a calmness I didn't feel. We're going to need to walk to the next station. I'll lead the way with the emergency lamp. It's only about 600 meters ahead. The evacuation procedure is well established. I gathered the passengers, 9 in total, and led them out of the front of the train onto the narrow maintenance walkway that runs alongside the tracks. Our progress was slowed by the increasing amount of water in the tunnel, now ankle deep and rising steadily. Has there been a pipe burst? Someone asked. Most likely, I replied, not believing it for a second, as we waded through the darkness, our single emergency lamp casting grotesque shadows on the curved tunnel walls. I became aware of movement in the water around our feet, not the normal flow of a current, but deliberate, almost curious patterns, as if the liquid itself were examining us. And it was changing. What had been merely oily in appearance was now thickening, becoming viscous, almost gelatinous. It clung to our shoes and trousers with unnatural persistence. One of the passengers, a young man in a business suit, suddenly stopped, staring down in horror. "There's something in the water," he gasped. Something grabbed my ankle. Before I could respond, he let out a strangled cry and pitched forward, as if yanked off his feet by an immense force. He would have fallen face first into the now waist-deep liquid, had 2 other passengers not caught him. "Something's out my leg," he shouted, panic evident in his voice. "Pull me up! Pull me up!" The other passengers heaved, dragging him upright, but it was clearly a struggle against whatever had hold of him beneath the surface. When they finally wrenched him free, he was missing a shoe, and his exposed foot was covered in what looked like burn marks. Perfect rings of blistered flesh, as if something was circular, sucker-like appendages had attached itself to him. We increased our pace after that, practically running despite the deepening water and treacherous footing. I kept my lamp trained on the path ahead, trying not to think about what might be lurking in the murky depths around us. The voices returned, no longer confined to my radio, but seeming to emanate from the tunnel itself, from the walls, the ceiling, the very air we breathe. We were here first. We will be here last. When your cities crumble and your kind is dust, we will remain. Join us now. It's easier if you choose it. One of the passengers, an elderly man, began to respond to the voices, mumbling replies under his breath as if engaged in conversation. When another passenger questioned him, he looked up with a start, his eyes wide and strangely reflective, like those of a deep-sea creature. They'd built over their city, he said, his voice taking on the same hollow quality I'd heard on the radio. The Victorian engineers dug their tunnels right through it, thought it was just caverns, natural formations. It wasn't. It was theirs, has always been theirs. I urged the group forward, keeping a firm grip on the elderly man's arm. His skin felt unusually cool and slick beneath my fingers. After what seemed like hours, but couldn't have been more than 20 minutes, we reached Golders Green Station. I expected to feel relief at the sight of the illuminated platform, but something was wrong. The station was completely deserted. No staff, no waiting passengers, despite this being a major interchange that should have had security personnel even at this late hour. More disturbing was the state of the station itself. It appeared dilapidated, decayed, as if abandoned for decades rather than simply closed for the night. Water streamed down the tiled walls, pooling on the platform. Some of the tiles had fallen away, revealing behind them not concrete or brick, but a strange, membrane-like substance that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. "This isn't right," one of the passengers whispered. "This isn't Golders Green." But it was. The signage, the distinctive architecture. It was unmistakably Golders Green Station, yet simultaneously not. As if we were seeing it through some distorting lens, or perhaps seeing a version of it from another time, another reality. The elderly man who had spoken in the tunnel suddenly broke free from my grip and rushed toward the platform's edge, moving with a speed that belied his age. "They're waiting," he called out, his voice now completely transformed, gurgling and wet like someone speaking underwater. "They've always been waiting." Before anyone could react, he leapt from the platform, not onto the tracks, but into what should have been a solid wall opposite. Instead of colliding with it, he passed through as if the wall were merely a projection, a hologram, where he had vanished. The wall rippled like disturbed water, then stilled. The remaining passengers began to panic, some running for the exits, others frozen in shock. I tried to maintain order, directing them toward the emergency stairs that would lead to the surface. That's when the station lights went out, plunging us into total darkness save for my rapidly dimming emergency lamp. In that darkness, the water began to rise more rapidly, now knee-deep on the platform and climbing. And within it, shapes moved, fluid, ever-changing forms that suggested human outlines, but were decidedly not human in their movement or proportion. "The exits are sealed," said a voice from the darkness. The businessman who had been attacked in the tunnel. His tone had changed, becoming similar to the elderly man's. "They've been sealed for a century. This is one of the first places they claimed. A nexus point, a place where their world and ours overlapped." My lamp flickered, briefly illuminating his face. What I saw sent me stumbling backward in terror. His features were melting, running like wax, revealing beneath them the same dark void I had seen on the figures in the tunnel. With my last rational thought, I directed the remaining passengers toward the main escalators. They were motionless, of course, with the power out, but would still provide a path to the surface. Assuming the surface could still be reached, we climbed in desperate haste, the water somehow rising behind us as if pursuing us deliberately, defying the laws of physics. 300 steps to the surface. 300 steps to safety. I don't remember much of that climb. Fragments remain. The sound of sobbing from passengers. The increasingly distorted architecture of the escalator tunnel, which seemed to lengthen and twist in impossible ways. The whispers that followed us, promising release if we would only turn back, surrender, join what they called the deeper current. 2 passengers did turn back. I couldn't stop them. They walked back down into the rising darkness with peaceful expressions, their eyes already transformed into black, reflective pools. The rest of us continued upward, finally emerging not into the familiar ticket hall of Golders Green Station, but onto an empty Hampstead Heath, miles from where we should have been. It was still night, but the storm had passed, leaving the air clear and cold. The ground beneath our feet was solid, blessedly dry. We stood there, the 7 survivors of a journey that had broken every natural law I'd ever known, looking back at what appeared to be an ordinary tube entrance, the familiar red and blue roundel glowing softly in the darkness. As we watched, the sign flickered, then went dark, and the entrance itself seemed to fold inward, like paper being crushed by an invisible hand, until nothing remained but undisturbed earth. The official investigation found nothing. The train was discovered stopped between Hampstead and Golders Green, empty but otherwise normal. CCTV footage showed us entering Hampstead Station, but never leaving. The 7 of us were found wandering on the heath at 3 a.m., suffering from what medical professionals diagnosed as shared delusion, possibly caused by carbon monoxide exposure. I returned to work after 2 weeks of mandatory leave and psychiatric evaluation. I drive the same route, even the night shifts. I had to prove, to myself more than anyone, that what we experienced was indeed some sort of hallucination. But I noticed things now that I didn't before. The way water seeps through certain tunnel walls in patterns too deliberate to be random, forming symbols or letters in a language I almost recognize. The extra seconds of darkness between certain stations, when the train seems to pass through somewhere that isn't simply a tunnel. The passengers who board at Hampstead late at night and ride to the end of the line without ever disembarking. Their reflections in the windows not quite matching their actual movements. And I've started having dreams. Dreams of vast, submerged cities beneath London, older than human civilization, inhabited by beings who have watched us build our world above theirs, biding their time, finding point of ingress to the holes we conveniently dug them. Sometimes, when I'm driving through the deepest sections of the Northern Line, and it's raining heavily above ground, I hear them calling through the walls of the tunnel. They know my name now. They're patient. They have existed in the darkness beneath cities since the first settlements were built, and they will exist long after our structures have crumbled. They're spreading, finding new ways to reach the world above. That's what the elderly passenger meant when he called Golders Green the Nexus Point. There are others, throughout the city, throughout the world, places where the barrier between their realm and ours has grown thin. The rain helps them. It creates connections, channels between their world and ours. It carries pieces of them into our reality. So tonight, as you listen to the rain drumming against your window, ask yourself, where does all that water go? Into the ground. Yes, into the sewers and drainage systems and underground rivers, into their domain. And what might be flowing back up in the other direction? Listen closely to the rain. If you hear a rhythm that seems almost like words, if the sound seems to be forming patterns that nearly make sense, don't listen too long. And whatever you do, don't answer. They remember those who acknowledge them. And London has many, many miles of tunnels yet to be dug. I need to tell someone about what happened during those long months of isolation, about what began as a strange nocturnal habit and evolved into something I still struggle to understand or believe. Perhaps by sharing this, I'll convince myself it was merely the product of a mind frayed by solitude and fear. Perhaps someone listening will recognize the pattern and warn others before it's too late. Are you alone right now? Is rain tapping against your windows, creating that peculiar sense of cozy isolation? The outside world reduced to ambient sound and blurred movement beyond glass? That feeling used to bring me comfort. Now it fills me with dread. I live alone in a small cottage on the outskirts of a village in rural Yorkshire. It's the sort of picturesque stone dwelling that features on postcards and in television programs about idyllic country life. Thick walls, exposed beams, a small garden bordered by an ancient stone wall. Quaint and charming, though drafty in winter and perpetually damp when the rains come. When a lockdown was announced last year, I wasn't particularly concerned. As a translator working primarily from home, my professional life would continue largely unchanged, and I've always been comfortable with solitude, preferred it even, no flatmates to negotiate with, no family members to accommodate, just me, my books, my work, and the gentle rhythms of a rural existence. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I established a routine, work during daylight hours, followed by reading or streaming films in the evening, weekly video calls with distant friends, occasional walks along the deserted country lanes, nodding at neighbors from a safe distance. A quiet life, but a sustainable one. Then insomnia began. I've always been a sound sleeper, typically unconscious within minutes of my head touching the pillow. But around the 6th week of lockdown, I found myself lying awake until the early hours, mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quiet. Nothing specific, not anxiety about the pandemic or financial worries, just a persistent electric restlessness that prevented sleep. After several nights of tossing and turning, I developed a new habit. I would sit by my bedroom window, which overlooks the garden and the fields beyond, and watch the night. There was something soothing about the darkness, the distant pinpricks of farmhouse lights across the valley, the shifting clouds obscuring and revealing the moon in turn. On clear nights, the stars were magnificent, undimmed by the light pollution that plagued cities. I began to look forward to these nocturnal vigils. There was a curious intimacy to them, as if I were the only person awake in a sleeping world. I felt both utterly alone and strangely connected to something larger than myself. The rhythms of nature, the ancient cycle of darkness and light. It was during the 3rd week of my new routine that I first saw him. The night was overcast, a light rain falling steadily since dusk. I sat in my usual spot, a comfortable armchair pulled close to the window, a mug of herbal tea cooling on the sill. The rain transformed my garden into a different place, glossy and reflective, every surface holding a liquid sheen that caught what little light existed. At first, I thought it was a trick of that light, a shadow cast by the old apple tree, or perhaps a garden ornament I'd forgotten about, a darker patch against the glistening grass, roughly the size and shape of a person. I leaned closer to the glass, squinting into the darkness. The shape remained, too solid to be a shadow, too still to be something moved by the wind. A figure, standing at the far end of the garden, just before the stone wall that separated my property from the fields beyond. My first thought was practical rather than fearful. A trespasser, perhaps, or a lost rambler seeking shelter from the rain. The pandemic had driven many city dwellers into the countryside, often ill-prepared for rural conditions and unfamiliar with property boundaries. I switched on my outdoor light, illuminating the garden in harsh electric brightness. The figure was gone. I searched the entire garden with my eyes, thinking they might have moved behind the shed or crouched below the wall. Nothing, just rain falling on empty space. I convinced myself it had been a visual anomaly, a combination of rain, poor light, and a mind made suggestible by isolation and insomnia. I returned to my armchair, switched off the outdoor light, and continued my night watch. 10 minutes later, the figure was back, closer now, standing halfway up the garden path. My heart rate accelerated, a cold trickle of adrenaline entering my bloodstream. This was no trick of the light. Someone was in my garden, advancing toward my cottage while I watched. I reached for my phone, ready to call the police, when something made me hesitate. The figure wasn't moving like an intruder. No furtive glances, no attempt to conceal itself. It simply stood there, apparently looking toward my window, toward me. I hit the outdoor light switch again. Once more, the figure vanished the instant illumination flooded the garden. This pattern repeated itself over the next several nights. I would sit at my window in darkness, and eventually, the figure would appear in my rain-soaked garden, always on wet nights, never when the weather was clear, always standing motionless until I turned on the light, at which point it would vanish as if it had never been there at all. Each night, it appeared slightly closer to the house. I began to notice details. The figure was male, tall and thin, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothing, a long coat or perhaps a cloak, and something on his head that might have been a hat with a wide brim. His face remained obscured, either by the angle of his head or by the poor lighting. By the fifth night, he had reached the midpoint of the garden. By the seventh, he stood just beyond my flower beds, perhaps 15 feet from my window, close enough that I should have been able to make out his features. Yet they remained stubbornly indistinct, as if the space where his face should be was somehow less substantial than the rest of him. I should have been terrified, should have called the police, or at least confided in a friend. But a strange calm had settled over me, a detached curiosity that felt almost scientific. I began taking notes. The time of his appearance, how long he remained visible, his precise position in the garden. I even attempted to photograph him using my phone, but the images showed nothing but an empty, rain-slicked garden. On the 10th night, something changed. The rain was particularly heavy, a proper Yorkshire downpour that drummed against the roof and windows with almost violent intensity. I took my usual position, expecting to wait at least an hour before he appeared, as had become the pattern. But he was already there, standing directly before my window, separated from me by only the thin barrier of glass. I jerked backward, knocking over my mug of tea, heart hammering in my chest. He was close enough that I should have been able to see every detail of his appearance. Instead, he remained a dark silhouette, featureless save for the distinctive wide-brimmed hat and long coat. Where his face should have been was only a blurred absence, as if that part of him existed slightly out of focus with reality. I reached for the light switch with a trembling hand, expecting him to vanish as he always had. But this time he remained, apparently unaffected by the sudden brightness. What happened next still disturbs me more than anything else in this strange episode. The figure raised his hand and placed it against the glass of my window, a deliberate, unmistakable gesture of contact. His hand looked normal, human, with long, slender fingers that pressed against the pane, leaving no print or mark despite the rain that should have made such an impression inevitable. Then he spoke. I couldn't hear him through the glass and the drumming rain, but I could see the movement where his mouth should have been a darker ripple in the blurred absence of his face. He was trying to tell me something. Without conscious decision, I found myself drawing closer to the window, straining to hear or at least to read the words from the movement of invisible lips. As I leaned in, his outline seemed to waver, becoming less distinct, more permeable, like ink bleeding into wet paper. For just a moment, I thought I glimpsed through him, not to the garden beyond, but to somewhere else entirely, a place of gray twilight, where similar figures moved in the distance, all with the same blurred absence where their faces should be, all wearing similar old-fashioned attire. His hand pressed harder against the glass, and to my horror, the solid surface began to yield, to soften like wax near flame. His fingers sank into it, penetrating what should have been an impenetrable barrier, reaching toward me. I scrambled backward, knocking over my chair in my haste. When I looked up, both the figure and the impossible distortion in my window were gone. The glass was solid, unblemished, reflecting only my own pale face and the room behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I turned on every light in the cottage and sat with my back to the wall, as far from windows as the small space would allow. When dawn finally broke, I closed all the curtains and blinds, blocking out both the rain, which continued to fall, and whatever might be watching from my garden. For 3 days, I lived like this, working by artificial light, venturing out only when absolutely necessary, always with the curtains drawn against the outside world. I told myself I had experienced some sort of hallucination, a waking dream born of isolation and disrupted sleep patterns. The mind, deprived of normal social contact, had simply manufactured an encounter to fill the void, a rational explanation, comforting, almost convincing, until the tapping began. It started on the 4th night, gentle at first, easily mistaken for the sound of rain against glass, but it had a deliberate rhythm that no random weathering could produce. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more, over and over, coming from every window in the cottage simultaneously, as if I were surrounded by invisible visitors, all trying to gain my attention. I huddled in the center of my living room, hands pressed over my ears, trying to block out the sound. It continued until dawn, stopping the instant sunlight, broke through a gap in my curtains. The next night was the same, and the next, always a tapping, always from dusk until dawn, growing slightly louder and more insistent each time. By the 6th night, it had become a knocking, firm, impossible to ignore, the rhythm now accompanied by the sound of what might have been voices, too muffled by the rain and walls to make out words, but unmistakably trying to communicate. Have you ever experienced the peculiar madness that comes from prolonged sleep deprivation? The way reality begins to fray at the edges, rational thought giving way to a dreamlike logic, where the impossible seems not only possible but inevitable? That's where I found myself after a week of the nocturnal knocking, exhausted, strung out, beginning to doubt my own grasp on reality. Perhaps there was a rational explanation for what I was experiencing. Perhaps the isolation of lockdown had affected me more profoundly than I'd realized. On the 8th night, driven by equal parts desperation and curiosity, I did something I still cannot fully explain or justify. I drew back the curtains on my bedroom window and raised a sash. The knocking stopped immediately. The rain, which had been falling steadily all day, seemed to pause for a moment, as if caught in a hiccup of time. Then he was there, the figure from the garden, standing just outside my open window, close enough to touch, close enough that I should have been able to see every detail of his appearance. Yet his face remained that same blurred absence, as if that part of him existed in a different layer of reality than the rest. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he extended his hand toward me, not aggressively, but in a gesture reminiscent of an invitation or a request. "I don't understand," I said, the blurred absence where his face had been rippled, and I had the distinct impression he was smiling. When he spoke, his voice was like distant radio static shaped into words, recognizable as speech but distorted, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We need the rain," he said, "to visit, to remember what was like." What was like? I asked. To be solid, to be singular, to exist in just one place, one time. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cool night air flowing through my open window. "What are you?" Again, that impression of a smile. "We were like you once, before the thinning, before we learned to exist between the droplets." "The droplets?" "Rain," he explained, as if to a child. "Water falling through air. Each droplet is a tiny lens, a doorway, a point where realities touch. We use them to visit, to remember. As he spoke, I became aware of movement in my garden and the fields beyond. Dozens of figures, perhaps hundreds, all with the same blurred absence where their faces should be, all dressed in clothing from different eras. Victorian frock coats, 1940 suits, modern raincoats, even what appeared to be medieval garb. They stood perfectly still, all facing my cottage, all apparently watching our exchange. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Company," he said simply. "Conversation. We get so lonely in the between." The between? The place that isn't quite anywhere, where we exist now. It's spacious, but empty. No sensation, no contact, except when it rains and we can reach through. I should have been terrified, should have slammed the window shut, called for help, fled the cottage entirely. Instead, I found myself oddly moved by the loneliness in that static-filled voice. How long had they been this way? How many rainy nights had they spent reaching out, hoping for someone to notice them, to speak with them? "Are you ghosts?" I asked. A sound like distant laughter rippled through static. "No, not dead, just elsewhere, thin." The rain helps us become substantial enough to interact. For a little while, he extended his hand again, closer to my open window. "Would you like to see? I can show you the between. Just for a moment, just a glimpse." Every rational part of my mind screamed a warning. But after weeks of isolation, of speaking to no one but the occasional delivery driver from a safe distance, the promise of contact, of connection, however strange, was irresistible. I reached toward his outstretched hand. Our fingers touched. His cool and strangely insubstantial, like grasping mist that had somehow developed surface tension. The moment of contact lasted only seconds, but in that brief interval I saw the world from the other side. The between, a place that overlapped with our reality but existed alongside it, like two sheets of paper pressed together. I could see my cottage, my garden, but they were ghostly transparent, as if viewed through clouded glass. And I could see them, hundreds, thousands of faceless figures, moving through a twilight landscape that was both my familiar surroundings and somewhere entirely different. They had been people once. Ordinary men and women from throughout history who had, through some chance or choice, stepped sideways out of reality. Now they existed in this liminal space, able to observe our world, but not truly interact with it, except during the rain, when the boundaries between realities grew permeable, and they were lonely, so desperately, achingly lonely. The contact broke as suddenly as it had begun. I found myself back in my bedroom, hand still extended to the open window, the figure standing before me as before. "Now you understand," he said, that static voice tinged with something like hope. "Now you can help us." "Help you how?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "Invite us in," he said simply. "With the right invitation from someone who has glimpsed the between, we can cross over properly, become substantial again, rejoin your world." Alarm flared within me. All of you? At once. That impression of a smile again, somehow both reassuring and deeply unsettling. Not all at once. The doorway would only admit one at first. Me. Then, perhaps, over time, others. And once you're substantial again, what then? "Then we live," he said, the static in his voice vibrating with longing. "We experience your world as we once did. Feel the wind and rain on solid skin. Taste food. Touch others. Be seen. Be heard. Be real." It sounded harmless, compassionate, even, but something held me back, an instinctive warning that transcended rational thought. There was a hunger in his voice that didn't match his measured words, a desperation that spoke of more than simple loneliness. "I need to think about it," I said, beginning to close the window. His hand shot forward, faster than I could react, grasping my wrist. His touch was firmer now, more substantial, no longer misty but cold and solid. "Please," he said, the static voice hardening. "We've waited so long, watched through so many rainy nights. You're the first to see us, to speak with us, the first who can help." I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Let go," I said, a tremor of fear entered my voice. "Just say the words," he insisted. "Invite me in. That's all it takes. Then I can help you understand everything. Show you wonders you've never imagined. Let go of me." I yanked my arm back with all my strength. His fingers slipped away, but not before I felt something pass between us. A cold current that ran up my arm and settled somewhere in my chest, like ice water injected directly into my veins. I slammed the window shut and locked it, backing away until I hit the opposite wall. The figure remained outside, watching me with that faceless gaze. He raised his hand, pressed it against the glass as he had done that first night. This time, the glass began to ripple immediately, softening under his touch. I fled the room, locking the door behind me as if that could keep him out when windows had already proven permeable to his touch. I huddled in my bathroom, the only room without windows, until dawn, listening to the sound of tapping that came from every glass surface in the cottage. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. Over and over, growing more urgent as the night progressed. When morning came, the tapping stopped. I emerged cautiously from the bathroom, checking each room with growing hope that the long night had ended, that whatever strange visitation I had experienced was over. The cottage was empty, the windows solid once more. Outside, the rain had stopped, sunlight dappling the wet garden with gold. No sign of the figure or his countless companions. I spent the day boarding up my windows, a difficult task given limited supplies during lockdown, but I managed with what I had: old shelving, duct tape, even books stacked against the lower panes. Anything to create a barrier, to block the view both in and out. That night, there was no tapping, no knocking, only silence. The same the next night, and the next. For almost a week, I convinced myself it was over, that whatever momentary thinning of reality I had experienced had closed again. The visitors from between returned to their twilight world. Then the rain returned, a proper storm this time, with thunder and lightning transforming the night into a chaotic alternation of darkness and electric illumination. I was working late, my laptop the only source of light in my boarded-up living room, when I felt a sudden chill, the kind that comes not from cold, but from the certainty that you're being watched. I looked up slowly, dreading what I might see. He was inside, standing in the corner of my living room, more substantial than he had appeared outside, but still with that blurred absence where his face should be. Water dripped from his long coat onto my carpet, though not enough to explain his presence, not enough to constitute a doorway between worlds. Unless I felt it then, the cold spot in my chest where that strange current had entered me when he touched my wrist, the piece of the between that had transferred to me during our brief contact, the doorway he had needed. "You're inside me," I whispered, understanding blooming with horrifying clarity. You used me as a doorway. That impression of a smile, stronger now that he was fully present in my world. "Not exactly," he said, his static voice clearer within the walls of my cottage, "but close enough. I only needed a fragment of the between to take root in this reality. You provided that, unwittingly but effectively. What do you want?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. He moved closer, his movements more fluid now, more natural. The blurred absence where his face should be was beginning to define itself. features emerging like a photograph slowly developing. To live again, he said simply, to be substantial, to endure beyond the rain. And how do you intend to do that? My voice was surprisingly steady, considering the hammering of my heart. He was close enough now that I could see his face taking form, handsome in a severe way, with high cheekbones and deep-set eyes that reflected no light. There's only room for one of us in this reality, he said softly. One consciousness per body. That's the rule, the law of substantiality. I understood that. The cold spot in my chest was not just a doorway. It was a foothold, a beachhead from which he intended to launch a full invasion of my body, my identity, my life. You want to replace me? I said. Another smile, this one fully formed and terrifying in its gentle certainty. Not replace, merge, subsume. I'll retain your memories, your knowledge of this time, enough that no one will notice the difference. A fair exchange, I think, for a life I lost centuries ago. And I'll be the one in the between, watching through raindrops, unable to interact except on stormy nights. Yes, he admitted, though you'll have company. So many of us waiting for our chance. And who knows, perhaps someday you'll find your own unwitting doorway back. The cold in my chest was expanding, tendrils of ice spreading through my veins. I could feel him growing stronger within me as I grew weaker, my very substance being thinned to make room for his. Please, I gasped as my fingers began to lose sensation, a numbness spreading up my arms. Don't do this. He watched me with something like compassion, though it did nothing to slow his advance. I've waited too long, he said. Existed too long in that half-life. Felt too little, experienced too little. Your time will come again, perhaps, but mine is now. I fought. Of course I fought. But how does one battle an invasion that comes from within? A colonization of self that spreads cell by cell, thought by thought. I lost consciousness as his presence reached my mind, the cold spreading into my very thoughts, freezing them, replacing them with his own. When I awoke, the storm had passed. The morning sun shone through gaps in my makeshift window coverings, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden light. Except I wasn't quite I anymore. I remember everything about my life, my childhood, my education, my career as a translator. I can access every memory as if it were my own. But alongside these familiar mental pathways exist others. Memories of a life centuries past, of a London unrecognizable to modern eyes, of a man who studied ancient texts warning of places where the world grew thin. He is here with me, in me, not a separate consciousness, but merge of my own, his thoughts and desires layer over mine like a palimpsest, where both texts remain legible if you know how to look. Sometimes when it rains, I feel him more strongly, feel his satisfaction at experiencing the physical world again. The taste of food, the sensation of sunlight, the texture of pages between fingers. His hunger for these experiences is boundless, childlike in its intensity. And sometimes in those rainy moments, I catch glimpses of between, that twilight place where the others wait, watching through the droplets. Watching me, specifically, with a patience and hope that is terrifying in its intensity, because they know what he did, know it's possible, know that on some rainy night, if they find the right person at the right window, they too might return. I write this not seeking help. It's far too late for that. But as a warning, if you live alone, if you find yourself drawn to watching the rain at night, if you ever glimpse a figure in your garden who vanishes when light falls upon it, close your curtains, lock your windows, wait for clear skies. There are those who exist in the spaces between raindrops, in the thin places where realities touch. They are patient. They are lonely. They are hungry for what we take for granted, the solid certainty of a single existence. And they are watching, always watching for an open window, a receptive mind, a moment of connection. The rain is starting again outside. I can feel him stirring within me, rising closer to the surface of our shared consciousness, eager to experience the familiar sensation anew, but now from the inside rather than beyond the glass. The others are gathering too. I can sense them in the garden, their faceless forms becoming visible as the rain intensifies. They're looking toward my window, toward me, with that same patient hunger. One of them raises a hand in greeting. I recognize him, though I've never seen him before. He wears the clothes of a 1940s businessman, his features becoming clearer as the rain falls harder. I feel my hand rising to wave back, independent of my will. Feel myself moving toward the window, drawn by a compulsion I cannot resist. He, the one within me, wants to help another cross over, to hold the door open, just a crack, just enough for one more. I'm fighting it, but I'm not sure how long I can resist. The rain helps them, weakens the barriers, makes everything permeable, including my will. If you're listening to this and rain is falling outside your window, ask yourself, are you alone, truly alone? Or is someone watching, waiting for you to notice them? Waiting for you to wonder what exists beyond the glass, in the spaces between raindrops? Whatever you do, don't open the window, and don't look too closely at your own reflection. You might notice something wrong, a slight delay in your movements, perhaps a moment where your expression doesn't quite match your emotions. The first sign that you're beginning to thin, that something else is taking root within you, something patient, something hungry, something that has waited centuries for a rainy night and an open window.